Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Today, inshallah, we're going to complete chapter 5, which is the government and fiscal policy. In this chapter, we will focus on the government policies or the fiscal policy that's used by the government. And we will study the government spending multiplier and the balanced budget multiplier as well as the tax multiplier. As you know, in the last class, in the previous chapter 4, we discussed how to calculate the investment multiplier, which was delta y. This is the investment multiplier, which is delta y over delta I equals 1 over 1 minus MBC. This is the investment multiplier. In this chapter, we will study the government spending multiplier. And as you see, or as you know, that we discussed or we learned that if the government or the business sector increased its investment by $100 million, this leads to increasing of aggregate output by larger amount or greater amount of $100 million, which depends on the marginal propensity to consume, right? So this leads to increasing of aggregate output by larger or greater than $100 million by the value of the marginal propensity to consume. As you know that the value or the change, the value of a change in the aggregate output or aggregate income depends on or sensitive to the marginal propensity to consume and the value of the change in investment, right? And as you see, if suppose that the investment increased by $200 million, this is the increasing investment, and suppose the MBC in this case equals 0.75. How much is the change in the aggregate output? Aggregate output, delta y, over delta I is the increasing positive $200 million equals 1 over 1 minus 75. So to derive, so delta y over 200 equals 1 over 0.25. So delta y equals 800. So as you see, the increasing of investment by $200 million when the MBC equals 0.75, the aggregate output would increase by $800 million, right? To make sure, let's take an Excel exam, or to apply using Excel. I will learn you something in order to make sure that our work is right, is correct. So, suppose here, the investment, the increasing in investment is $100 million, as you see. As you see, as we mentioned that if the business sector increased its spending or the planning investment increased by $200 million and the MBC, the marginal propensity to consume, equals 0.75, the change in aggregate output or aggregate income equals $800 million. Let's see by Excel here. The planned investment increased by $200 million. In the first stage, the aggregate income or aggregate output increased by $200 million, right? The group who received $200 million as income will spend or use 75% out of this income for consumption by how much? 0.75, which is the MBC. So in the second stage, we have a new income created equals by how much? Equals 0.75, which is MBC, times the previous $200 million as a consumption. So how much is the value here? 150, right? Then the group who received $150 million will spend 75% out of this amount on consumption, right? So we have a new income will be created to another group by how much? By 75% out of 150. So we we expect that in the next stage or the next phase, 0.75 times 150. So as you see, these are what? The additional increasing in aggregate income. Yes, finally we will reach to the 0. So let's calculate the summation of the change in aggregate income. As you see, let's do the summation. How much is the change? 799.7 or $800 million, right? So this is as a result of the multiplier, right? So if we add more here, finally, if this amount equals 0, the value, the summation of the change in aggregate output would equal how much? Yes, $800 million. 799.9. Finally, it would reach to $800 million, which is already calculated here by the formula, right? Let's go to another issue. Sometimes, if the planned investment increased or decreased by 100 or 200 or $100 million, suppose that we have a decreasing in the planned investment, delta I declined by $50 million. And suppose that the MBC equals 0.8. How much is the change in aggregate output? In this case, delta Y over delta I equals 1 over 1 minus MBC, or delta Y over delta I is a decreasing, so it should be what? Minus. So over minus 50, because we have a decreasing in aggregate investment, right? So equals the same idea, 1 over MBS or 1 minus MBC, which is the MBS, 0.2. So 0.2 times delta Y equals 1 times 1 minus 50. So delta Y equals minus 50 over 0.2. How much? 200 minus 250. This is what? Delta Y. This means that the aggregate output or the aggregate income would decline by 250. Right? Okay? Is it obvious? Is it clear? Okay. Let's go. And what about the MBC? The increasing of the marginal propensity to consume leads to what? Leads to increasing of aggregate output, right? So suppose the marginal propensity to consume increase. This leads to increasing the change in aggregate output, right? And we explained or we discussed it in the last class. Let's go to the another topic, which is the expenditure. I'm sorry? Okay. امسحي. Okay. In the closed economy with no government, let's do a distinction between, or the difference between, the closed economy with no government, closed economy without government. Here we have the closed economy with the government. Closed economy with a government. If you work under the closed economy with no government or without government, Y equals C plus S, right? This is the aggregate income. Has two parts, consumption and saving. and the aggregate expenditure equals C plus I, right? At equilibrium, Y equals aggregate expenditure, or C plus S equals C plus I, right? So at equilibrium, saving or the planned saving equals the planned investment. Leakages equals injection, right? But if we have a government, as you know, the fiscal policy, the government, or if we have a government, the government collect taxes and spends for different services and goods and services, right? The G is the government spending. Taxes is the taxes or the net taxes that collected by the government, right? In this case, Y, the aggregate income, is the part has three parts: consumption plus saving plus taxes, because part of your income will go to the government as a tax. What about the aggregate expenditure? Here we have to add, we must add the government spending, because as we mentioned before, that the government purchases different goods and services, so, or invests sometimes. So we have the aggregate expenditure, we have to add the government, equals C plus I plus G, right? At equilibrium, Y must equal aggregate expenditure. So C plus S plus T equals C plus I plus G, right? C deducted. So at equilibrium, if you work under the closed economy with a government, C or S plus T equals I plus G, or the leakages equals injection, right? As we mentioned before in the last class, saving is a leakages, and saving and taxes are leakages, and I and the government spending are injections, because I and G, the planned investment and the government spending, stimulates the economy, and they lead to what? To increasing of the aggregate output, employment, aggregate income, and so on. But these taxes and saving, they would not stimulate the economy, right? Is it clear? Okay. Sorry, yes. The first point? I'm coming to this point now, right? Okay. Let's go to another issue, which is the disposable income. The disposable income. So as we mentioned in this chapter, we will add the government as a part of the economy. So part of our income will go for the government as a tax, and we might receive transfers from the government, right? So we have a net tax or net taxes. The term of net taxes. The net taxes is the difference between the payments or the taxes paid for the government by the households and the business sector, and the transfers, the payments transferred by the government to the households and business sector, right? So the difference between, or the taxes, or the net taxes equals the taxes paid by the firms and the households to the government minus what? The transfer payments made by the households to the government. The difference between these two things is what? The net taxes, right? Okay. Yes. صافي الضرائب. تمام؟ طيب. As I mentioned, that part of your income goes for the government. So we have a concept which is the YD. YD means the disposable income. فاكرين disposable personal income اللي هو personal income minus what? The taxes, right? Yes. So when we added the government So we have a YD, which is the disposable income. The disposable income equals Y minus taxes. Right? Y minus T. Another issue. At the same time, the YD, the disposable income, is divided into two parts. After deduction of the taxes, the YD equals consumption and saving. شو بضل عندي؟ Consumption and saving. If I pay the taxes for the government, in this case, I can use my disposable income for consumption and saving. So at the same time, after the deduction of the taxes, YD, the disposable income, equals S plus T. S plus C. Saving plus consumption, or consumption plus saving. Right? If this part equals this part, what do you say? This part must equal this part. So Y minus T equals S plus C. Let's derive Y. So Y in this case equals saving plus C plus T. This is the point, Muhammad. Did you touch it? Yes. So, as I mentioned, that the aggregate income or the total income equals the saving. Part of your income goes for saving. Another part goes for consumption, and the last thing goes for the taxes, or the taxes for the government, the net taxes. Right? تمام؟ واضحة الأمور ولا مش واضحة؟ طيب. Another thing which is, so here we are talking about Y, about the income, the total income. What about the expenditure? The expenditure, aggregate expenditure, equals C plus I plus G, which is, or when we added the government, yes. Exactly. So, here as you see, aggregate, when aggregate expenditure equals C plus I plus G. At equilibrium, Y must equal aggregate expenditure, as we mentioned before. So at equilibrium, Y must equal aggregate expenditure, or this side must equal this side. So the right side equals the right side in these formulas, right? So at this point, S plus C plus T equals C plus I plus G. C was deducted with C. So finally, the saving plus taxes equals I plus G. Leakages equals injections. Is it clear? مين أعيد له؟ إيه؟ حبايبي مين أعيد له؟ واضحة الأمور؟ Okay, تمام. The same, yes. صحيح. طيب, let's go to the budget deficit, or the government budget. As I mentioned, that the government, when the government used a fiscal policy, it used the government spending and it collect taxes. The difference between the government, the spending of the governments and the taxes collected is what? It's the deficit or surplus of the budget, right? So if the government spending is larger than the taxes that it collects, in this case, what would happen? We have a budget deficit. عجز في الموازنة. If suppose that the government decided to spend $1,000 million and it collected taxes by $800 million, this means what? We have a budget deficit, right? So suppose, so as you see, the budget deficit here in the formula equals the government spendings minus the taxes. So 1,000 minus, the taxes collected, okay, G minus T. Yes, it's the budget deficit or surplus, right? If the government collected taxes larger than we have a deficit and so on, right? Okay. If the government has a deficit, what should it do? Yes, this is number one. Or it can sell treasury bonds or treasury notes or bills. If the government needs money or has a deficit or faces a deficit in its budget, in this case, it can sell treasury bonds and bills for the public. The sold or the selling of bonds or treasury bonds means that the government collect money, so it can face a deficit by selling treasury bonds or notes, right? Okay. When we in the previous chapter, the last chapter, the consumption function C equals A plus BY. Now, the consumption is or equals, this is when there is no, when we work under the closed economy without government. But if we have, if we work under the closed economy with a government, C must equals A plus BYD. Because the consumption here depends on the disposable income, not the income. Because we can consume, or our consumption depends on the available money or the available income that can we use, which is the disposable income in this case. So C, or when YD equals, when YD equals Y minus T. So the consumption in this case, consumption function equals A plus B times YD, Y minus T. صح؟ مظبوط؟ So C equals A plus B times Y, BY, minus BT. صح؟ Right? Is there a problem? حاضر. أعيدها كلها? Okay. In the closed economy with no government, C, the consumption depends on or equals A, the autonomous consumption, plus B, Y, because Y in this case equals C plus S, right? But when we have, and with there was no taxes, or there no net taxes. Now, we added the government, so we cannot control all of our, or cannot use all of our income for consumption and saving. So we have to pay taxes for the government, or we can receive sometimes transfer payments from the government. So our consumption depends on what? The disposable income, not the income as a whole, or the total income. صح؟ صرنا نعتمد أو الدخل الاستهلاك تبعنا مبني على الدخل المتاح للتصرف. So when YD, as you know, that YD equals Y minus T. So C equals A plus B times YD. YD substitution, Y minus T. So C equals A plus B times Y, BY, B times minus T minus BT. This is the consumption function under the closed economy with the government. Yes. Okay. And the government or the economy, or we have two main factors affect the investment, the planned investment, if we have a government. Number one is the tax policies. If the taxes increase, the investment would decline. And the second thing is the interest rate. There is a negative relationship between the interest rate and the planned investment. If the banks decided to give you or to increase the interest rate, you would prefer to put your money in the banks, so the investment would decline. Right? So there is a negative relationship between the interest rates and the planned investment. Let's go to this example. As you see, we have an economy with a government, and the consumption function for this economy is C equals 100 plus 0.75 YD, and C, or C equals 100 plus 0.75 Y minus T. And we have the following information. the aggregate output, this is Y. This is the net taxes. These are the given information. The question is calculate the YD, the consumption, and the saving. And as we mentioned here, that the investment is given, the planned investment, the government spending is given, and the net tax is also given, right? So, and then we will calculate the aggregate expenditure and the unplanned inventory change. So as you see, Y equals 300, 500, 700, and so on. The net taxes equals 100. It's fixed. It's constant, right? The question is derive or calculate the consumption. As we mentioned, that the consumption function equals C equals A plus B YD. So we have to calculate what? The YD before as a column, then we will enter, we will calculate consumption easily. YD equals what? So YD equals Y minus T, or the aggregate output or aggregate income minus taxes. So YD equals Y minus T. The aggregate income minus the taxes paid for, the net taxes paid or transferred. So 300 minus 100 equals 200. This is the YD, and for all points, right? The same, we have to do the same for all cases or all points. So is it easy to derive or to calculate the consumption? Yes. Because we have the following consumption function. C equals 100 plus 0.75 YD. So C equals 100 plus 0.75 YD. So in the first case, for the first case, C equals 100 plus 0.75 times YD. For the first case, YD equals how much? 200. So C equals 100 plus 75% of 200 قديش 150. So equals 250. This is what? This is the consumption, right? And the same, we have to do the same for all points or all cases, right? تمام؟ طيب. Calculate the saving. No. We will see. Exactly, because the question, or here the question is calculate S, saving. If we work under the closed economy without government, saving was equal how much? As you know, in the without government, Y was equal C plus S, right? So S was Y minus C, but now Y equals C plus S plus T. So S equals how much? Y minus C minus T. Y minus T is what? YD. So S equals YD minus C. Right? Yes, 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 yes. So, as you see, the saving equals YD minus C. YD, in the first case, 200 minus the consumption, 250 equals minus 50, and so on. For you have to do the same for all cases, right? We are already given the planned investment and the government spending. Let's calculate the aggregate expenditures. The aggregate expenditure. As you know, that the aggregate expenditure equals C plus I plus G. So the aggregate expenditure here as, this is the aggregate expenditure, equals C, how much is C? 250 plus I 100 plus 100 equals how much? 450. This is the aggregate expenditure, right? And the last column S. And you have to do the same for all points. Another question which is calculate the unplanned inventory change. Unplanned inventory change. As we mentioned, in the closed economy without government, we have to do a comparison, or the unplanned inventory change equals Y minus aggregate expenditure. It's the same if we have a government. So the unplanned change in business inventory or inventory change equals Y minus aggregate expenditure. So Y equals how much here? Y, 300 minus the aggregate expenditure. 300 minus 450 equals minus 150. Right? صح? Calc or determine the equilibrium output or the equilibrium income. The equilibrium occurs in or when Y equals aggregate expenditure if we don't have a government, right? And the same if we have a government, the equilibrium occurs when Y equals aggregate expenditure. So where is the case in which Y equals aggregate expenditure or the unplanned change in business inventory equals 0? Because when Y equals aggregate expenditure, the unplanned inventory change equals 0. It's this case when the aggregate output equals $900 million. Right? صح؟ مظبوط ولا لا؟ So in this case, Y equals $900 million and the aggregate expenditure equals $900 million. So the unplanned inventory change equals 0. So this is here we have or it's the equilibrium point. مين عنده مشكلة؟ مين حابب يعيد له طيب؟ إيه؟ حاسين الأمور معقدة ولا؟ Yes. The last point. Yes. The last point, as I mentioned that, or the question is determine the equilibrium aggregate output or the aggregate income. As we mentioned, the equilibrium occurs when the Y equals aggregate expenditure, صح? In this diagram. Suppose here we have, suppose that we have the following figure. This is the Y, and here we have the aggregate expenditure, C plus I plus G. The equilibrium occurs when Y equals the aggregate expenditure. This is E. Y equals aggregate expenditure. In this case, we have, or the equilibrium is occurred. So let's do a review the different cases. In the first case, Y equals 300, right? And the aggregate expenditure equals how much? 450. Are they equals? No. The second, the third, and the fourth case, we will find that the aggregate output equals $900 million and the aggregate output or the aggregate expenditure equals the same. So in this case, it's the only case which determine the equilibrium, right? تمام? Okay. So as you see in this diagram, the consumption function, or this is Y, the blue or the black line is Y. The blue line is the consumption function, which equals A plus BYD, or C equals 100 plus 0.75 YD, right? If the government increase its spending, or we have I plus G, yani we added the investment and the government spending. So we have the aggregate expenditure equals how much? Aggregate expenditure equals C plus I plus G. The same formula, plus I plus G. So we have an upward shifting of the consumption function or the aggregate expenditure function. صح? Which leads to what? This is the original equilibrium. The intersection between saving and aggregate output, consumption and aggregate output. Here we have the equilibrium point where Y equals aggregate expenditure. This is E. Now suppose that the government decided to increase its spending by $50 million. Suppose that the government decided to increase. So here we have the equilibrium output is $900 million, right? In the previous example, or the last example. If the government decided to increase its spending by $50 million, شو اللي بصير؟ There is an upward shifting of the aggregate expenditure function parallel to the previous one. صح? So, in this case, we have a new equilibrium. This is E1, E2. How much is the new equilibrium aggregate output? This is the question. So, let's go to the same part. In the previous exam, the government spending increased by $100 million, as you see. How much is the increasing of the government spending? $100 million. But now, suppose that the government spending increased by $150 million. This is the question. So, the government has increased from, or G, the government spending has increased from 100 in the table to 150 instead of 100. So, the same results, the same idea. Here we have Y, the taxes, or the net taxes. We have to calculate YD. Then the consumption, C equals 100 plus 0.75 YD, saving IG. In the previous exam, we assumed that the government spending increased by 100 million, but here $150 million. So the planned aggregate expenditure equals C plus I plus the new G, the new government spending. So what would happen? The unplanned inventory change equals how much? Then the adjustment to the this equilibrium, or the equilibrium. We have a new equilibrium point. In the first example, when the government increased its spending by $100 million, why? The equilibrium aggregate output equals how much? $900 million. But now, when the government increased its spending by $150 million, how much is the Y, the equilibrium Y? It has increased to 1,100, as you see. صح؟ اللي هو وين ال Y equals aggregate expenditure. كانت عند 900. اليوم تغيرت. Now the Y has increased, or the aggregate output, the new equilibrium aggregate output equals 1,100. This is the new equilibrium output. Right? واضحة ولا مش ولا صعب الأمور شايفينها؟ إيه؟ واضحة تمام ممتاز. طيب let's go to the government spending multiplier. The government spending multiplier. As we mentioned that the investment multiplier is investment multiplier delta Y over delta I equals 1 over MBS, or 1 minus MBC. But now we will talk about the government spending multiplier, or the government spending multiplier, which is delta Y over delta G equals 1 over the same, 1 minus MBC. Or delta Y over delta G equals 1 over MBS. So the question, suppose that the government decided to increase its spending by $300 million. And the MBC, suppose, let's take the following example. Suppose the government increased its spending by $300 million, or decided to increase its spending by $300 million. And the MBC for the community equals 0.60. Calculate the change in the aggregate output, or the aggregate income for this community. So, as you know that the government spending multiplier delta Y over delta G equals 1 over 1 minus MBC. So delta Y over delta G, which is increasing by $300 million, equals 1 over MBS for 0.40. Right? So delta Y, or for 0.4, times delta Y equals 300. So delta Y equals 300 over 0.4 equals how much? قديش؟ 7,500. في رقبة على عاتقك هذا. طيب. اوكي. طيب. Suppose, let's derive the multiplier. The multiplier for this community equals how much? 750? Okay, 750. Okay, so this means that when the government increased its spending by $300 million, this leads to increasing of the aggregate output and aggregate income by $750 million, right? From this information, derive or calculate the government spending multiplier. We don't ask you about the change in aggregate output, what we are talking about, or we are asking about the government spending multiplier. As you know that the government spending multiplier equals how much? Equals 1 over MBS, or 1 over minus 1 minus MBC. So in this case, this is the government spending multiplier. Government spending multiplier. So the government spending multiplier equals 1 over 1 minus 0.6. So the government spending multiplier equals 1 over 0.4 equals how much? 2.5, I think. So in this case, the multiplier equals 2.5. This means what? If the government, 2.5 means if the government increased its spending by $1, the output, the aggregate output would increase by $2.5. يعني معنى كده إذا الحكومة زودت إنفاقها $1, الأجريت output would increase by $2.5. تمام؟ واضح الأمور ولا مش واضحة؟ Okay, suppose that we have the following information or the following consumption function, and y as and the net taxes are given. So the aggregate consumption function is or equals C equals 100 plus 0.6 YD. The net taxes or Y, if income is $1,000, Y equals $1,000, and the net taxes equal $300 million or $300. The question is, calculate the consumption or the aggregate consumption. Exactly. So C equals 100 plus 0.6. YD equals Y minus T. So C equals 100 plus 0.6 times Y equals how much? 1,000 minus 300. So C equals 100 plus 0.6 times 700. So C equals 100 plus 420. So C equals 520. That's it. Right? صعبة؟ تمام. يعطيكم العافية.